about mallows, hardy hibiscuses? Who grows those beautiful mallows with the big, huge hibiscus? Y'all aren't growing mallows? Oh my goodness, big old flowers. Well, what happens to the mallows at the end of the year, around about October? They go dormant, and all you have left are sticks sticking up above the ground. Cold doesn't do that. They just naturally go dormant. So even though the mallows produce these woody stems during the summertime, they're considered herbaceous because those stems die at the end of the season and don't persist from year to year. The main issue, though, is that those plants that have woody stems tend to be woody, and those plants that have herbaceous stems tend to be herbaceous. Any questions? Because this is an important concept. We divide plants into woody and herbaceous all the time. The crybaby tree, Erythrina christagalli, yeah, it's a tree. Now, it may freeze to the ground every year and come back up, but that's still a tree. You can't take away from a plant what it actually is, even though we may grow it differently. So any other questions on woody and herbaceous? All right, so when we use the word perennial, now you know that it's an abbreviation. When you asked for where the perennials were, you left out two words. When the staff person heard you say perennial, they heard those two words that you left out. And the two words are hardy and herbaceous. The word herbaceous throws out all the woody plants. So when you say perennial in common usage, we know, just because we know, we're talking about just herbaceous plants, not woody plants. It's understood. Hardy, what does hardy mean? What does hardy mean? Well, we wouldn't have to say it twice. Hardy. This would be like saying a woody herbaceous plant. So you have two different terms. So what does hardy refer to? Tough, resilient, easy to grow? Throw that definition away. In gardening, hardy does not mean it's tough, resilient, and easy to grow. Has nothing to do with how tough or resilient the plant is. It has to do with its cold tolerance, period. Hardy plants can be the pickiest, most persnickety, most difficult plants to grow in the world, but they can tolerate the cold. So plants that are hardy are able to survive the cold where you garden without any extraordinary effort on your part. Plants that are hardy reliably survive the winter where you garden without any extraordinary effort on your part. If a plant wasn't hardy, that is, if it couldn't survive the winter, it wouldn't be a perennial for us, would it? We couldn't grow it as a perennial because it wouldn't reliably live from year to year, even though it could in the tropics. It can't here because it gets too cold. So if a plant is going to live from year to year for us, it has got to be hardy. The opposite of hardy is tender. And again, tender doesn't mean you can cut it with a fork. Tender refers specifically to cold tolerance. And plants that are tender are those plants that are not hardy enough to reliably survive the winter where you garden without extraordinary effort on your part, without covering it up every night it's going to freeze, without bringing it inside to protect it, without putting lights on it, providing it heat, and then covering it up, without building a greenhouse over it and putting a heater inside of it. I mean, there are all kinds of things we can do to get plants through the winter, but those are tender plants. So do you have a good working idea about what tender and hardy mean? Two very important words. Again, they refer specifically to cold tolerance or lack thereof. All right, let us zoom on to page 2. Y'all, yeah. Go ahead. It feels so good to turn that page. Turn that page. Roots. What we're doing now, and there are kind of three categories to the lecture. We've got the beginning lecture where we talked about the classification and Latin names and everything. Now we're going to be focusing on the plants, their parts, the different organs that compose plants, how these organs function with each other, and how what they do and how they live affects how we garden with them. And so again, I'm going to try to take the scientific information and relate it back to the real world with my magic whiteboard here and get these points across. So again, this is going to be looking at the different plant parts, the roots, stems, leaves, and flowers. And then finally, the third section we get into the plant processes and environmental factors affecting plant growth. And I have a PowerPoint program we can look at some of that on that. So that's where we're going for the rest of the day. You'll be amazed that I talked as long as I did when y'all are finished this afternoon. I start off with the roots. What is the first thing a seed produces when it germinates? And what does that tell you about the importance of roots to a plant? If the first thing an embryo plant does when it wakes up and ventures out into the real world, the first thing it does is it makes a root. Roots are the foundation of the health of a plant. A plant cannot be healthy without a healthy root system. If you don't remember anything else from the hours we spend together, I want you to remember how profoundly important the health of the root system is to the health of a plant. And the reason why I have to stress this to you is that because roots are underground, they're out of sight, and out of sight, out of mind. So we obsess over the foliage of the plant. Oh, there's a hole in this leaf. Oh, there's some spots on that leaf. Oh, what do I need to do? As if there was something terrible going on. Plants are resilient to their upper portions. Some of y'all have tropical plants that freeze to the ground in the wintertime. And if there's just a little bit of the base of the trunk left, it'll sprout back out and grow again. The entire upper part of the plant is ravaged and lost to the cold, and yet that plant still recovers, survives, and grows again. Now you take that plant and you dig it up out of the ground and you cut its roots off. There is absolutely no way that plant will ever survive that. So we could cut the whole top off the plant and it comes right back up again. The top is exposed to the world. Plants have had to get used to the tops getting chewed on by cows or ravaged by caterpillars or cut back with a bushwhacker or whatever happens at the top of a plant. They can recover from that. The roots are protected underground. Plants have no real ability to tolerate damage to their roots because in nature they don't have to tolerate damage to their roots. Their roots are protected. So remember, the root system is critical to the overall health of the plant. The top of a plant will be sick if the roots are sick. The top of the plant will be sick if the roots are sick. So those are all important ways to change maybe how you look at your roots. What do they do that's so important for the plants? Well, they absorb water from the soil. The only way that plants can drink the water that they need, and they need water constantly, is through their root system. That is the only way they can drink the water they need. So anything that affects the functioning of the root system affects how the plant can get the water it needs. And if anything affects the roots negatively and decreases their ability to absorb water, the plant gets thirsty. The plant gets thirsty. And if the roots are so badly damaged by digging the plant up to move it or by root rot, saturated soils, that they stop functioning altogether, the plant collapses, wilts, and dies of thirst. So the plant cannot tolerate much damage to the roots because that's the only way it can get the water that it needs. And if it can't get the water that it needs, it will react very quickly to that. It also absorbs the minerals. Plants absorb minerals from the soil. They need minerals to be healthy, just like we need minerals to be healthy. So plants absorb calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, manganese from the soil, and these minerals or essential elements are needed by the plant to grow normal and be healthy. Just like if you need iron, you may take an iron supplement because we need a certain amount of iron. Plants don't get enough minerals out of the soil. What do? We add more minerals with fertilizers. So fertilizers are products that we use to make sure there are enough of these essential elements in the soil for the plants to grow their best. If the roots are sick and they're not absorbing the mineral nutrients that may be there already, then the plants will not be normal. They will be sick. They won't grow well. So plants can get sick from their roots being sick, either because the roots won't absorb the water and the plants get drought stressed or die of thirst, or because they're not absorbing the minerals and the plants get yellow, have all kinds of deficiency symptoms showing up. You fertilize them and it doesn't do any good because the roots are not absorbing the minerals. You water a plant that's wilted and it perks back up again. Have y'all ever done that? That's called a big sigh of relief. I caught it just in time. Perks right back up again. So if the water is there and the roots are healthy, then watering that plant is all it needs. But if the roots are sick and you walk up to that plant and you look at it and you stick your finger down in the dirt and the dirt is wet and you water it just to be on the safe side and it doesn't respond, it stays wilted, then that plant's a goner. It has root rot. And while plants can survive and recover from being too dry, if you keep a plant too wet and cause root rot to occur, that's fatal. So it's better to water too little than it is to water too much for the health of the root system. So absorption, absorbing waters and mineral. Anchorage. You know, it's kind of distressing when you plant a sunflower, you know, and it blooms and the flower gets heavy and the darn thing just won't stay upright. It's just leaning this way and leaning that way. So what do? You go, you get a stake and you put a stake by it and you tie it to it. And that takes care of the situation. That's where anchorage is an issue. The sunflower is too top heavy and we've bred them to have such huge flowers now, it's hard for them to stand up. That's a minor issue. So what is it that holds that large water oak growing by your house up in a hurricane? Well, the roots. The roots hold it up. The roots hold it up. And so anchorage is important. What if you damage the roots of a tree? Well, if you damage the roots of the tree, if you cut some of the roots, you may make the tree more likely to go over in a storm. So again, here in the deep south, in the Gulf coastal south, where we are prone to hurricanes, we are extremely protective of the root systems of our shade trees. We are loath to damage or bother them. If we absolutely positively have to, we will. Sidewalk work, driveway work. But we know that every time we cut a root on a tree, we reduce that tree's ability to hold itself up in a storm. And we'll talk about taproots in just a little bit. All right, food storage. We take advantage of this when we eat carrots and rutabagas and turnips and parsnips and radishes. Many plants store food in their root system and then take advantage of that food later on. So those are the three primary functions of a root system. Types of roots. Heard mention of taproot, and what that means is that in some plants, when the seed germinates, what does it do? And in Latin, the word for root is radical. That just means root. And so that's called the radical that first comes out. In the case of a taprooted plant, the main root comes out, the top begins to grow, and this root that first comes out never loses dominance. This root maintains dominance and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. But it never loses the dominance. So a taprooted plant will look sort of like this. Think of a carrot, again, or a parsnip. For plants that are fibrous rooted, the seed germinates and sends out the radical, sends up its top growth, but instead of this radical staying dominant, it branches and branches and branches and branches more, and this creates a more fibrous root system. One of the things to keep in mind as a gardener is it's easier to transplant plants with a fibrous root system than plants with a taproot system. When we dig down, we oftentimes lose a large portion of some of the roots that are absorbing the water, and when we dig up a plant with a fibrous root, look, we get a whole lot more of the root system, a whole lot more functioning roots. So one thing to keep in mind is in transplanting, fibrous is easier than tap. So that's fibrous and taproots and the difference between them. Now, the next section, we're moving on to page 3, root distribution and development. This is some really important information that relates to how we garden. And that is that the root system of the plant breathes in oxygen and breathes out carbon dioxide just like we do. It's just the upper part of the plant that photosynthesizes, that actually takes in carbon dioxide and gives off oxygen. The roots don't photosynthesize, they just respire like we do. So they're absorbing oxygen. And where do they get that oxygen from? From the air spaces that are in the soil, the little pore spaces in the soil. You can't see them, it doesn't feel like there's air in the soil, but a good soil is as much as 25% air spaces. So that's where the roots are getting the oxygen that they need. Now when you look at a plant growing in the ground, with its root system, where is the oxygen coming from? Here, from the atmosphere. There is no oxygen that is bubbling up from the ground. All the oxygen is coming from the atmosphere down into the soil. And the further you penetrate into the soil, the lower the oxygen levels become. Most of the oxygen is in the upper part of the soil, closest to the atmosphere. Roots need oxygen. Most of the oxygen is up here. So where do you think the roots are likely to be? Up here. And indeed, for most plants, the majority of the root system is in the upper 12 inches of soil. Most of the root system is in the upper 12 inches of soil. Can y'all see that okay? Little light, but I think it's working. Let me carefully read these. Dry erase. Thank you, Miles. All right, so let's look at a tree. And think about its root system. So we have the trunk here, and let's imagine the roots of this tree. Imagine the roots of this tree. What does the root system look like? Well, the root system extends out 2 to 3 times the width of the canopy. The root system extends out of a tree, extends out 2 to 3 times the width of the canopy. We call this area here the drip line. Although if you have ever stood under a tree in the rain, it drips all under the tree. But this is where the rain gets kind of shed and drips down. The most important roots of this tree are located under the canopy of the tree, but the roots extend out well beyond the canopy. The roots are primarily in the upper 12 inches of the soil. So the root system of the tree looks like this. A large, flat, plate-like root system with a few roots going a little bit deeper for anchorage. The roots that absorb the water and the minerals the tree needs are here. At least 80% of the root system is in the upper 12 inches of soil. There is no taproot on our trees. Now, if you've ever walked by a flower bed and you have a live oak in your yard, and you see a little seedling growing in your flower bed, and you will if you have a mature live oak in your yard, and you figure while you're there you might as well get rid of it, so you walking by, you just kind of reach down to pull it up, and it pulls back on you. So you get both hands on it and you finally get it out of the ground. That little seedling that big has a black taproot about that long on it. So you imagine when that oak is 50 years old and 30 feet tall, and it must have a taproot that goes 25 or 30 feet down into the ground, and that just doesn't happen. And the reason is that that seedling gets older, the taproot loses dominance, and a more branching fibrous root system takes over. And many of our trees are like that. Pecans have a taproot when they're young, and that taproot disappears as they get older. All trees have root systems that are pretty much like this. So this is why I told you we have to be very careful about the roots of our trees. If you just put a 12-inch trench, you wanted to put in the irrigation system, or you wanted to put in some utility lines, and you just dug a little 12-inch wide and 12-inch deep trench that ran by the trunk of that tree, what you have essentially done is severed the roots on that side of the tree. Again, this compromises the tree's ability to absorb the water and the minerals that it needs. And so this may affect the overall health of the tree. It may drop a lot of foliage, get kind of bare. You've probably seen poor trees that are struggling. The canopies are thin, there's not as much foliage as there should be, and oftentimes when you look down, there's a parking lot underneath them or some sort of construction that was going on. So again, that damage compromises the tree's ability to get its water and minerals. The top of the tree, the top of any plant, is in balance with its root system. The top of any plant is in balance with its roots. The roots are absorbing enough water and minerals to keep the leaves happy. The leaves are making enough food to provide food for the root system. When you take that balance away, then the tree can't support as much of the canopy as it did. Can't support as many leaves, so branches may die, leaves may drop. And again, the other major issue is anchorage. We have compromised the anchorage of this root system and made this tree more likely to go over. If you look at trees after a hurricane and they have blown over, and all of you have seen trees that have blown over either on TV or in real life, you notice the root system is a flat plate. A flat plate, there it is right in front of you. So the roots are in a flat plated form like that. And the more we damage them, the less there is to hold the tree up. Notice the trees that go over in hurricanes, oftentimes they're trees on the street, between the sidewalk and the street. And those are trees that have most likely had their roots damaged by street work or sidewalk work. And those are the trees that tend to go over the most. So keep in mind, it's easy to read that roots tend to be relatively shallow due to their need for oxygen. This is what comes out of that one statement. This is what comes out of that one statement. Any questions on that? One last thing before we leave the roots. What you got?
12 inches.
Oh.
The roots are about 12 inches deep?
Yes. One last thing. Let's see, how many baby boomers do we have? A few. Well, when we were teenagers and in our 20s and we were rebellious, and let me tell you, we were a very rebellious generation, weren't we? I tell you. We had a word, and this is the word that we used for the government, for the police, for all of the authority figures that were telling us what we needed to be and do. And who can remember what that word was? The establishment. These days we just say the man, but back then it was the establishment. So why in the world am I talking about the 70s? Because as you know, this word comes into gardening. How many of you have read something in a book or on a tag that says, water regularly until established? So you read that and thought, what the heck is established? Maybe after it's been in the ground for a while, maybe that's what it means. And establishment, the reason I'm talking about it now is that it has everything to do with the root system. So the word establish means when you put a plant into the ground, it has to grow its roots from that original root ball, where they're all confined to that root ball. The roots have to grow out into the surrounding soil. If the plant doesn't do that, it will not reliably establish or survive in that location. The growth of the root system into the surrounding soil is the establishment process. So when we talk about a plant getting established, we're talking about it growing its root system from the original ball that was planted and getting its roots out into the surrounding soil. Until a plant does that, the only water it can access is the water in the root ball. It can't access any of the water that's in the bed. The roots are only in the root ball. The plant can only absorb water where there are roots growing. So until it sends its roots out into the surrounding soil and has access to a much larger area for water, it is prone to drought stress. And that's why watering is linked with establishment. During the establishment period, while the root system is growing out into the surrounding soil, we have to pay careful attention to watering because that plant may need to be irrigated. It may dry out the root ball faster than the rest of the bed dries out. Are y'all following me? So that's why watering is paired with establishment, because until the roots get grown out into the surrounding soil, the plant has a hard time getting the water that it needs, all the water that it needs. So we have establishment of transplants like bedding plants and vegetables. These are generally plants that are planted in relatively small containers. It could be a tomato transplant, or you might be planting some marigolds. These are transplants, and it takes transplants about 2 to 4 weeks to establish. That is, from the time they're planted into the ground, it takes 2 to 4 weeks for these plants to get their roots growing out into the surrounding soil. Once that happens, they're more on their own, and we can stop pampering them quite so much. Have you ever noticed when you plant transplants, like bedding plants, flowers, or vegetables, for a week, they just sit there, maybe for 10 days. 2 weeks. They don't grow out of the ground like a beanstalk when you plant them. What is happening is the plant is going through its establishment period until it gets its roots out of the surrounding soil and starts absorbing all that water and mineral nutrients that's available to it out here. It doesn't grow as fast. So that time that it's not growing very fast is the establishment period. Plants will not take off and grow until they get their roots established. How many of you have ever heard about pinching the flowers off of plants when you plant them into your garden? The reason for that is there's a hierarchy in how the plant distributes its food. When the leaves make the food isn't distributed evenly to everybody. It goes to the flowers and the seeds first. That is, any flowers or seeds are provided with all the food they need first. Then the leaves get a crack at the food. They get all the food they need. Then the stems get the next crack at the food. And then finally, the root system is the lowest in the list about who gets the food. So if you're putting bedding plants into the garden, what is the most important thing for them to do? Grow roots. They either grow roots or they die. They've got to grow roots out in the surrounding soil. So it's more important for these plants to grow roots than it is for them to bloom initially, even though that's why you planted them. Now, nobody does this. Can you imagine a professional picking up a bunch of flats of flowering bedding plants, showing up at somebody's house in the morning while they're on the way to work? They see all these beautiful flats of color, and they're putting them into the flower beds, and when they get home from work that evening, they're all in there and there's not a flower on them. They picked all the flowers off of them. But there's a logical reason based on how plants grow for doing that. If you take all the flowers off, now the plant takes all the food it's making and sends more of it to the roots. So that's why you take the flowers off when you put transplants in. At least that's why it's recommended. Nobody does it, but that's why it's recommended. How about taking cuttings? If you take a cutting from a plant in bloom, the directions will tell you take off all the flowers and flower buds. The same reason, the food made in the leaves needs to go down to the end of the stem to make roots grow. Doesn't need to be blooming a flower on that cutting. So again, there are good reasons why the advice you get about gardening is given to you. There really is an underlying scientific reason based on how plants grow.